Hi, my name is Kim Williams, and I'm the director for Sacramento Building Healthy Communities. And we are so happy you're joining our podcast today, where we're going to be talking about issues that are impacting Sacramento and our communities. And I'm joined by two lovely guests. We have Tiffany Wilson, who is a social researcher and evaluator, and Kendra Lewis, who is a housing advocate. And we're going to talk about community benefit agreements and why they're so important to Sacramento. But before we get started, I'm going to ask Tiffany, can you help folks understand what a community benefits agreement actually is?
Sure. So let's, for example, say a developer's coming into Sacramento and wants to build a really large development, 550 housing units, 200,000 square feet of commercial space. What would happen is the residents, the developer, and the city would get together and they would have a conversation about residents would bring forward the issues that they have and the benefits that they would like to see result from that development. And the developer would talk about what they're willing to give. And then the city would also talk about what they might provide. And so as a result of that conversation, they would draft what is a community benefits agreement, which is a legally binding document that outlines what that conversation or usually series of conversations resulted in. So that's generally what a community benefits agreement is.
So, Kendra, when you think about community benefits agreements and the issues that we see facing so many of our communities, why is a community benefit agreement so important?
Well, CBAs are very important, I would say primarily to prevent displacement, to encourage jobs, especially where the community can benefit from the jobs. There's a lot of advantages to the community really understanding like how they can benefit from, and not it's just a developer coming in, building something and then leaving.
So, as Sacramento has grown a lot over the last several years, and we've seen a lot of development coming into Sacramento, what are some of the challenges that you've seen around large development in Sacramento, and how has that impacted communities?
Oftentimes, these big developments are going into places where maybe the property values were lower relative to other places. So, with that, again, is the displacement, loss of cultural fabric. Right? Because a lot of times, Sacramento, and unlike a lot of places I've lived, there's a lot of multi-generational living that is occurring in these neighborhoods where you talk to people who are like third generation who have lived in that area, right? So when you see these big developments come in and you see housing go up and rents go up and people having to move, well, it's a loss of that cultural fabric. It's a loss of that history.
Yeah, I agree. I think that historically, there's been probably little engagement with people, and it's just, oh, this is a great thing, you'll benefit, and people don't. And so I think that Sacramento really needs to slow that process down because things have just changed in the region so much and so fast that the CBAs are really important.
Tiffany, I know you've done a lot of research on CBAs over the years. Why would CBAs be a bad thing? Why would someone not want to have a community benefits agreement in place?
The first place that my mind goes, and this gets back to, touching on the issues we talked about, is that it's power sharing, right? So a community benefits agreement, if it's truly done in a way that's most productive to produce those outcomes where those that are most impacted by the development are able to have their voices lift up and have their needs prioritized and move forward, that's power sharing. And I think that, we in our country have a tendency through our culture and our socialization to have people want to control and keep power and not share power. And I think lastly, because there's a lot of really bad community benefits agreements that have been enacted. And so if you look to, and when they're not done in the correct way, they can cause a lot of additional trauma to a community, and they can really erode trust. And I think erode trust not only from community members, but from developers and from those folks that work for cities and counties. So, I think there's a lot of different reasons why folks are resistant or hesitant to see them as a positive tool.
That's a good point. So when we think about CBAs, what are, and you said some of them are really bad, and we've seen some. What are a few components of a bad CBA that you've seen?
Well, based on my research, some of the components are, one where negotiations aren't truly collaborative, right? Where you don't have all of the necessary voices at the table. So you don't have those folks that are most impacted by the development at the table talking about how they're going to be impacted in their needs. You maybe have just a splinter group of folks that are coming together to make the agreement. So it really speaks to, one person or persons perspectives and not multiple perspectives, where the language of the agreement is so general and so broad that there's no ability to really truly implement it in a way that speaks to the needs. And I think too, sometimes in development, it's very common where someone will buy a piece of land, they'll go through and they'll get what's called entitlements, which is basically all the approval that they need to go through for a city or a county to build that development. And then they'll sell it. They'll sell it as an entitled parcel. And so if you have a community benefit agreement that doesn't have the language that makes sure that that agreement sticks with the property as opposed to the owner, right? Well, then it doesn't manifest. So
the enforcement piece is so important, which is why you want that legally binding. You want the contract so that you can make sure that those standards that folks are held accountable to what they have put in those community benefit agreements. Kendra, if you're able to,
winner throat today.
Because I kind of want to talk about the opposite of that, or like, what are some of the good components that can go into a really good CBA?
Well, I would say, good components are jobs, good jobs, not part-time jobs with no benefits. I want to be clear about that. That happens a lot. It creates collaborations that are unusual. People who oftentimes are at loggerheads most of the time can come together and work together and work through things. So I think those are those opportunities. In some of these, education, we didn't mention it, but schools and some of the surrounding education, there's benefits again with workforce development and those types of things. When I said jobs, I mean more instant as it relates to the actual development, but then, there could be also opportunities for workforce development and pipeline for the future.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key issues is people seeing the benefits of what I think the benefits outweigh the negatives, right? And so I think, some of the things you mentioned, as well as seeing, housing trusts put in place, small business protections that are put in place, I think are really important. The jobs are a big piece, the traffic control, what happens when development comes in and you now have a lot of traffic coming into neighborhoods, and which means environmental issues. So how are those things, or how are those communities protected? And if you put a really good CBA in place, all of those things can be addressed, which I think is important. Something both of you mentioned that I want to touch a little bit on too is the importance of community voice in this process. How do folks make sure that their voices are heard when going through a community benefit process and trying to get a community benefit agreement in place? What does the community have to do to make sure that happens?
Well, you have to have trusted partners at the table that are going to really collaborate. There are basic things, having meetings when people are not at work, having daycare and food, for folks, especially working class, working poor folks, having, having translation materials and people who, having sign, for folks hard of hearing or have disabilities, just that's basic access. And then really, I think it's important because so often this work, it's very dense. It's hard to understand. So having it really, translated into something that's simplistic that people can actually understand and feel like they then can digest and articulate.
Also, this, I think, communication around the process. I mean, we're seeing in California specifically a lot of movement within the development community and at the state level to strip back those opportunities that residents have to engage in the development process. Because we don't learn about development in our K through 12 education, right? We don't learn about local government in the way that we should, and land use, and how all of our lives are so vastly impacted by all of the policies and the things that are implemented at that level, while simultaneously having a lot of policies and processes that are rolling back those opportunities for residents to have their voice in order to speed up development for developers.
Mhm. It's a very good point too. I think that community voice piece is so imperative in this work. I mean, in any issue that we have, in our city, but in this particular work too, is because residents know best what's needed in their communities, and a lot of times the decisions are being made by folks in other places and all their offices, and developers are making decisions and city governments making decisions, but it isn't. They're not talking to the people who actually live there and that will be impacted on a day-to-day basis by what's happening. And I think that's such a big piece of this work as well. So I think my next question is around, when we think about community benefits agreements and you have residents and, what their needs are, you have the developers, what their needs are, you have the city who, of course, gains economically from these developments. But what can city government do differently to really help build up more CBAs in Sacramento? Like, what would it take for city government to be partners with community on helping to ensure that community benefits agreements are in place when large development comes into Sacramento?
Wow, Kim. I would say, what can they do is, first of all, be open to them. They have to be open. If they're not open to them, it just, it's an uphill battle for everyone. So I think that there's that. Dedicate resources as much as they can, because it is, it impacts everyone, in the given areas. And I think the more that we do those, I think the better off the region would be.
Yeah, I would agree. And openness.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know right now we're currently in a time where there's a lot of, structural deficits and concern about the financial resources that we have. Reality is government, Austin, has way more resources than community does, right? So have an openness to it and use the resources that they have to facilitate and bring people together. They also oftentimes have relationships with developers that community doesn't. So being willing to, leverage that relationship and bring people to the table and really create an environment where folks can learn to trust one another.
Yeah.
Some basic level of trust anyway, maybe not a deep, like invite you over to my house for dinner kind of level of trust, but the ability to be in conversation with each other and hear one another. Yeah. Right. So developer not only hears community concerns, but community can understand and hear what the developer's concerns are, and really help create a space for true dialogue.
And I would add to that, what we've got to do more of is not to erase the history and the people. That is what really, I think, triggers people to not want to just check out, is you can't just come in, develop, not only not give people a voice, but not understand where that community came from. And I think it's really important. And to me, that's a big part of the city. They know these spaces in those ways. So I think it's, honoring the legacy of the community is really important. Many times in these communities, there's multi generations who've been there and who've been there, seen it all. And I think that's really important to honor those legacies.
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful point. I think I've heard from time to time, as we were embarking on, trying to get community benefit agreements in place for other projects, and the fear of developers feeling like, or government officials feeling like we won't get developers to come to Sacramento if, we have these CBAs that have to be put in place. But when I think about, who's having the conversations with developers who are wanting to build here in Sacramento, do they really understand the legacy? Do they really understand the rich history of a lot of our communities? And if they understood that, would a developer want to come in and be a partner in a project and looking at how they can come in and help build up a community versus kind of tearing it down? And I think, have either one of you heard that sentiment before around it'd be difficult for developers to come to recruiting developers to come to Sacramento if we have CBAs in place and things like that? And what's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's at every turn.
Yeah.
What, elected officials, a fear, right? They operate with a fear mindset, and I mean, not being a developer, not being an elected official, not having that responsibility. So I can't say that I have I have Tiffany's like myopic view on this. I think what I would say would be, why live in fear, and why not propose something that benefits everybody, right? There are jurisdictions, there are places in the United States where community benefits agreements, not only just agreements that are done by projects, but ordinances, right? That then are applicable to all development in a jurisdiction of a certain size or of a certain type. Development is still happening in those places, right? So I think the thing that I don't understand when they lift that up is Sacramento offers a lot. It's almost like you don't trust and you don't have faith in what this area offers and why a developer would want to come here and do a project. It just seems like you don't really see the beauty of what your city offers, and you're operating in a fear mindset, and somehow Sacramento is less than, is how it feels to me.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is operating in fear, and I think that um, a, s- a city that wants to at least have that engagement, it's important to the electeds and the people. Who are we really looking out for? And I think that it forces developers to really honor, again, the city they're coming into, or, the space they're coming into. Um, and it happens all over the country, everywhere. And so, if you don't ask, why would a developer, why would they? But if you do, um, having, been, in proximity of this, not too many of them are going to turn down billions of dollars. I mean, that would mean that you would just walk away. If it's, they want the project, there's the money, then, that there needs to be that conversation. So I think it's not a lose-lose. It's, it's negotiation. And so I think it's important that the cities don't allow the very traditional extractive kind of development, versus, really looking at economies that are far more inclusive, and and so that folks all benefit. I mean, that's what the B in benefit means, is benefit,
Right.
community
Right,
benefit.
right.
And so the developer develops, excuse me, and the people benefit. That's, so what does that look like? Really looking at what those letters stand for. What is the, we know the C, but what is the benefit for the community?
Good.
And I think the other piece too that I would lift up and would want, I mean, I actually would love to have a conversation with an elected official about this, quite honestly, because you do hear it so much, right? Is there's also, to me, it seems like this perception that developers are just these benevolent philanthropists, right? That are coming in with absolutely no personal gain.
Right.
And it's like, at the end of the day, they're making a lot of money a lot of times off these developments,
That's
which is why they're developers.
Right.
Which is why they have a lot of power.
Exactly.
And I mean,
No, they're not doing it for free.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we could go
Exactly.
There's just this idea that there's this benevolence there that I've never really understood. And then I also look at places in Sacramento, right, where there has been this kind of bend over backwards to get this development in place, because there's this perception that once this development goes in, suddenly the whole area around it's going to benefit. And we're seeing small businesses close left and right around those big development areas. Right. We're not seeing an influx of tourist dollars as a result of them, which is, I think, what a lot of times these municipalities really are trying to get at, as opposed to really building up the local economy, right? And creating place for residents who are going to be here and spend their money all the time. That's so I think that's the other thing too, that when I hear that, I'm just perplexed.
So I think what we're talking about when we talk about, who benefits, in the community benefit, you have the developer they're going to make their money, right? You have the city who's going to benefit from, the taxes that come in from the folks who are, spending their time, their energy, their money at what's being developed. But it's the community. And they're in certain cases, depending on what the community benefit agreement is and what the development is. There are some benefits to folks. For example, if you're a homeowner, right? Your housing, the equity in your housing may go up, and that's a good thing for a homeowner. Downside is for somebody who may be a renter, then you can't afford to rent there anymore, right? And so that comes up as a piece, and I think that's why. When we talk about community benefits agreements, it's all those pieces go into what those agreements should look like, right? And what types of developments have you seen CBAs be used for? So folks have an understanding of what development could garner a CBA. Is it?
I'd go back to my research on this. I mean, the one community benefits agreement that I know of in Sacramento was on the arena.
Which
right?
arena?
The
one?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Sorry. But in my research, I found that, I mean, for the most part, they tend to be agreements that are in place for large development, like a stadium, like an arena, a project that's going to have a lot of residential units plus a lot of commercial. They don't tend to be in response to
store strip.
Yeah, like a grocery store or like a 30-unit apartment complex.
Right.
Or, I mean, we're talking about, large development that really has the ability to impact a large area around it. But in my research, I did see that there were various sizes. And the thing that was interesting is that relative to the size of development would be the benefits, right? So like in St. Petersburg, Florida, they have a community benefits agreement ordinance that has 3 different tiers of development. The larger the development, the more benefits that are negotiated, right? The smaller the development, the fewer benefits that are negotiated. So they are of different sizes and scales, but I would say for the most part are applicable to really large new development projects.
Yeah, SoFi Stadium in Inglewood is one. It's huge. It was a big one. Southern California probably has a lot more of them in California than I would say probably in Northern. I don't know if I'm familiar with any in the Valley. Are you familiar with any in the Valley? I don't think so.
No, I mean, Staples Center in LA was really, I think, the community benefits agreement that got community benefits agreements into people's vernacular, into advocates' understanding of a tool that they can use to shape the land use environment. Yep. Portland has used them for really large infill projects because, as Portland is redeveloping over the last 20, 25 years, some of that old industrial property or, old legacy properties are being torn down and development's coming in. So it's large. Again, it's kind of large in scale, infill development in a very urban environment. There's been examples out of Detroit. Detroit's got a pretty good community benefit ordinance. Again, that's another area where you're seeing a lot of redevelopment.
Baltimore
and urban core.
Yeah. And, I would say one that didn't see the end, and I could be wrong, was at the Google or Facebook expansion. And it was the campus. There was one right after Aggie Square, but I think that some of the CBA part didn't quite, I think it fell apart. Yeah.
And I do know there were some, I think, in that Alameda County at some point around some work. I want to say there might have even been something happening in Berkeley at some point around a CBA as well that was happening. And I know we do see them a lot around large stadiums. And Kendra, you just brought up Aggie Square. And I think that for here in Sacramento, I think is a very important significant CBA here in Sacramento that folks really worked on, which wasn't a stadium. It wasn't Golden One. It wasn't tied to the industry, the entertainment industry or the sports industry, but it was really tied to a hospital system, or actually it was really tied to the university system, but also the neighborhood and what went into that piece there. And I know we'll talk about the UC Davis Aggie Square project and Sacramento Investment Without Displacement at another time, but I do think it's very important to talk about how that CBA impacted the surrounding areas and why it was so important. So you have two examples of what happened with Golden One, and then the lessons learned from Golden One that went into the CBA that was put in place for Aggie Square. And as we see more development coming into Sacramento, wanting to see more of these types of CBAs put in place, where do you see the future of CBAs in Sacramento now? That we've seen some things happen. What do we feel about Sacramento having more CBAs?
I mean, I don't think they're going away anytime soon. I mean, the struggle continues, I would say, because Sacramento is probably one of the many places in Northern California. I would say, there's a corridor of cities that are really having some substantial development. And so Sacramento is one of them. I think the Solano County area is another. The Bay Area is just really kind of unique in that sense. But I think it is, as long as there's groups around that can really bring people to the table, I don't think they're going to go away. They're not easy, but I don't think they're the movement is going to go away.
Yeah.
I wish I could read the tea leaves. I don't see community not wanting them anymore. And that is the interesting thing I think about the land use policy environment is community stays pretty static. Decision makers don't, which is another reason why I think community benefit agreements, community benefit ordinances are so important, right? So we're not over and over and over and over again as community expending our energy to bring these benefits. So I think advocates and, community builders are going to continue to request them. I wish I could say that I had hope for our elected officials, but based on some kind of recent history, there doesn't seem to be an openness to them. There doesn't seem to be a desire of elected officials, not all. I don't want to paint them with a broad brush, right? We definitely have some folks in the current administration that I think are open to really working with the city, but or working with the residents. But I don't see that openness right now. So I think we're going to have to continue as advocates and as community builders and people who really want to champion the needs of the people, going to have to keep ourselves busy.
Yeah.
Continuing to try and educate about the importance of these things, the ability of these tools, again, to really be a compromise that benefits all.
I think that's the key for it to continue and for it not to stop. I think for the average person, when it comes to CBAs, politics, local measures, all of these things, it's a lot. It's a lot when people are barely making ends meet. This region deserves much better than that.
And I think we need to engage developers. I mean, there's also a very contentious environment between some development and city right now. I just think there's a lot of room for all of us to create some understanding and to be thinking about how can we all leverage our assets and our strengths to make Sacramento a really amazing place.
Yep.
What are some of the things that we can do after hearing about CBAs to get involved or change the mindsets of folks that are in leadership around CBAs and wanting to see more of them in Sacramento?
Well, an ordinance would help.
Okay.
That's for consistency. It'd be interesting to kind of see how that would work. Looking at the what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, in the region, and who wants to be the developer, and then what's the relationship. It could be a game changer. People can understand them. They can understand what the areas and the needs are.
Yeah.
And that was part of a neighborhood advocacy group, and we developed a relationship with the developer. I mean, he came to the advocates and we had conversations about our concerns. He talked to us about what he needed to do for the development to shake out. And ultimately, at the end of the day, ended up giving our neighborhood association funds to do some transportation improvements on a street that the city didn't support. And then when that developer wanted to make some changes to his development and had to go have a public hearing, we showed up in support. So I do think sometimes the city can be a gatekeeper, if you will, that can prevent people from having that understanding.
That's very true.
I mean, I just think the more people that can use their passion and their energy in that way.
Yeah, it's a long-term game. It's not just something that it's going to get resolved quickly. You have to be committed to, the long term.
Yeah. That's very important for folks to remember, that if you're going to wade in this pool, you're going to be in it for a while. But the benefits that come from that are so great for your communities that it's worth the time and the effort when it can be successful. What would be, and this is for both of you, what would be one of the things that you would want to make sure that folks take away around CBAs and community power from this podcast today?
I mean, I'm a true believer in there's, where there's people, there's power. I mean, that is just dogmatic. It is part of my core. People can change things when they really don't think they could. And small wins matter as well. I think sometimes people say, oh, that's not, but it does matter. And so, I think that with the CBA, it is centered on people, and that's the most important part of it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I would want not just community, but I would want city officials, elected officials, developers to see that it is a tool in the toolbox that can create some consistency in the land use and development environment. And I think if we could all agree on an ordinance, could speed up the process, right? There's a lot of work happening in the land use policy environment right now to speed up development process, to create more housing, because we need more housing for folks, right? To make the entitlement process for developers quicker. But again, it's at the expense of community. And so I think if we could all come together and realize how much quicker we could get things done if we would all come together and collaborate and communicate.
Right.
And this is a tool for all of us to set the collaboration table, if you will, then you could speed up development from having a lack of resistance from community voice not being heard, and community being railroaded and gentrified and pushed out, which is the history of development in Sacramento, going all the way back to, right? So I think that would be the thing that I would want people to realize, is that this can be a collaborative tool that can benefit all of us.
Yeah, that's great.
I think for me, I love Sacramento, and I think Sacramento has so much potential, and I just want to see Sacramento be amazing. And I think there's so much potential for Sacramento to do just that. And I would want folks to know what a CBA is, and for community to know that it is a tool, and it is an option for all communities to look at, especially when they see development coming into their neighborhoods, and that this is something that they can use as a way to make sure, that their communities benefit from these developments and can tell you rich history. And I think that's so important, that if we're going to see Sacramento really become the city that we want to see it become, it's going to take everybody working together.
Agreed.
So that is my hope, that people learn more about CBAs, but that also folks who have power to help bring CBAs to fruition will do the work needed to support communities first, like put the community first in this, because everyone's going to, the others are going to benefit and get what they need from this development. It's going to happen, or they wouldn't be developing here anyway. So how do we make sure that our communities are taken care of? So, I appreciate you both for spending time with me today and talking about this issue. I think it's very important. We hope you learned a little bit more about CBAs today, and we are so glad you were able to join us. Please keep on the lookout. We're going to be doing more of these conversations about issues that are facing our community here in Sacramento and other topics. So please join us, stay tuned, and we look forward to seeing you again in the very, very near future.